Today we're going to begin a study of memory. And I always like to start this topic by introducing students to a test that is often given to people who are experiencing memory difficulties. And this is called the Wechsler Memory Scale. In the classroom, I always like to ask for volunteers to take subtests of the Wechsler memory scale. And often students are kind of hesitant to uh, until I tell them, well, this first test is the easiest one, and then somebody will volunteer. Now, the Wechsler memory scale is something that is given to people who are suspected of having a head injury or some form of dementia like Alzheimer's and so on. The person's answers are always compared to other people who are the same age to see how they compare. Are their memories about like other people their age, a whole lot better than other people their age, a whole lot worse than other people their age, and so on. And some of these items are have to do with auditory memory, and some of them have to do with visual memory. And this first subtest, which is quite easy, uh, is some general information questions. And so I ask some brave student who volunteers during class these questions. What is your full name? How old are you? When were you born? Where were you born? What is your mother's first name? Who is president of the United States? Who was president before him? What year is this? What month is this? What day of the month is this? What is the name of the place you are in? In what city is it? What day of the week is it? What time is it now? Well, students get this all correct, obviously. But if they give us any incorrect answers, we don't know if they're right or wrong because we don't know their mother's first name or where they were born necessarily. But we assume that they got all of these things right, and these are things that you don't tend to forget. Long-term information about things that are personal and that you use all the time. Well, we don't forget those kinds of things, although someone with a head injury might. When I played on the football team back in high school, I was a bench warmer. But I remember when the starting quarterback got injured and they brought him over to the sidelines, and our coaches were asking him what his name was. And I thought, are you kidding me? Our coaches don't know the name of our quarterback? Well, yeah, the coaches knew the name of their quarterback, Dan. They wanted to see if the quarterback knew his own name or not, because if he had sustained a head injury, maybe he wouldn't know who he was. Well, then I asked for another brave volunteer, and students are getting a little bit uh, more willing to partake in this little assessment. And so I take my next volunteer and I say, okay, I'm going to read you a little story. I want you to listen to it very carefully. And then when I'm finished, I want you to repeat back to me what I said. Here's the story. Anna Thompson of South Boston, employed as a cook in a school cafeteria, reported at the City Hall station that she had been held up on State Street the night before and robbed of $56. She had four small children, the rent was due, and they had not eaten for 2 days. The police, touched by the woman's story, took up a collection for her. Okay, now repeat back to me as best you can everything that you heard. And typically, whatever student volunteered gets any number of the details in the story right, but sometimes they add things that weren't really there. And so it's always kind of interesting. And then I say, okay, here's another story. Listen to this one. Robert Miller was driving a 10-ton truck down a highway at night in the Mississippi Delta, carrying eggs to Nashville when his axle broke. His truck skidded off the road into a ditch. He was thrown against the dashboard and was badly shaken. There was no traffic, and he doubted that help would come. Just then, his two-way radio buzzed. He quickly answered, "This is Grasshopper." Okay, repeat that one back to me. How accurate are you able to remember the details in the story without mixing some things up, adding some things that weren't in there, changing some of the details, and so on? Most of us have somewhat of a difficult time with that sort of thing. Then I asked for another volunteer. And to that person, I say, okay, I'm going to read words that are paired with other words, and then listen carefully to the list. And then when I'm finished, I'm going to say a word, and you tell me the word that goes with it. Here's the list: metal iron, baby cries, crush dark, school grocery, rose flower, obey inch, fruit apple, cabbage pen. Okay, fruit, obey, rose, baby, cabbage, metal, school, crush. And some students will get the whole list right, but typical individual will miss some of the words. And so then I read the list again and I read it again. I can read it up to 6 times. And what tends to happen with most of us is we tend to remember the words that logically go with the other words, like baby cries, uh, or fruit apple. It's harder to remember something like cabbage pen or crush dark. And so, when it comes to auditory memory, sometimes it's easier to remember things that logically go together. Then I ask for another volunteer and I say, okay, um, I'm going to read you some numbers and I want you to repeat them back to me in the same order that I say them. And these numbers I say to the person one per second. So it's 6, 2, 9, 3, 6, 9, 2, 5. And it gets all the way up to 3, 8, 2, 9, 5, 1, 7, 4. You know, with a lot of people, they'll remember the first things they heard or the last things they heard, and they tend to mix up the stuff in the middle. Although I have had some students be able to do the whole list perfectly. And then I say, okay, now I'm going to read you a list of numbers, and when I get finished, I want you to repeat them backwards. So if I say 5, 1, you'll say 1, 5. And then, it gets up to eventually 4, 7, 3, 9, 1, 2, 8. Can you say that backwards? So, this gets to do with short-term memory. And it's, can you remember the list long enough forwards and then repeat it backwards? This is a hard task. And for many of us, it's quite difficult. Well, then I give the entire class a visual memory task, and I'm going to actually give you that same task. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a design for 5 seconds, and then I'm going to take it away. And I want you to draw the design that I show you. Now, you can get a new sheet of paper out if you want right now, Or maybe if you want, you can just draw this design in the notes that you might be writing, okay? Excuse me, I got a dry throat. This lecture is brought to you by Rudy's. Anyway, um, you got your pencil ready? I'm going to show you this design, and then I want you to draw it after I take it away. Okay. Hold on a second. I've got technical problems here. Okay, here it comes. Okay, you see that? Don't start drawing it till I tell you to. Okay, draw what you just saw. Okay, you got that one? Now I'm going to show you another drawing. Don't start drawing it until I take it away. Here's the second one. Excuse me. Okay, draw that one. Are you finished? Ready to check your answers? Let's take a look. The first drawing, it's basically an X with flags on the ends, and the flags all face inward. Did you get that right? And then the second one is a square divided into four squares. And in each square is a square divided into four squares with a dot in the middle of each one. Did you get that one right? This has to do with short-term visual memory. And this is a type of test we call a recall test. You have to have seen it and then reproduce it. It's strictly recall. The next type of test I'm going to show you, and I was asked for a volunteer in class, this is a visual recognition memory task. And what I tell the person is I'm going to show you a design, actually three designs for 10 seconds. And then when I'm finished, I'm going to take it away and show you nine designs. And I want you to pick the three I originally showed you out of the nine. Okay? Are you ready? Here's the first three. Okay, here's nine of them. Can you pick out the original three? Excuse me. So this is what we would call a recognition test. Recall test, can you reproduce the design from memory? A recognition test is, can you pick out the original from memory? On a test that you might take, if you had questions that were fill in the blanks or short-term essay type questions, those would be recall type tests. Whereas a multiple choice kind of test is more of this kind, a recognition test. Can you pick out the correct answer? Okay. Well, let's go on with the lecture on memory. And let me pull up the PowerPoint slides for you. Um, hold on, because I'm not sharing my screen yet. Okay, here we go. So to remember something, first you have to encode it. You have to transform the information into a form that can be stored in your short-term memory. I don't know about you, but I often encode something by relating it to something that I don't have any trouble remembering. Uh, so to remember something, first you encode it, then you store it, and then, of course, you have to retrieve it, the act of bringing to mind material that has been restored in memory. Sensory memory holds information coming in through the senses for a period of ranging from a fraction of a second to several seconds. This is all the longer memory is in your sensory receptor, whether it's your receptors in the eye or the ear, just a fraction of a second to maybe a second or two. So to remember something, something has to get shifted from your sensory memory into your short-term memory. And short-term memory is rather limited. It holds about 7 items, a range of maybe 5 to 9 for less than 30 seconds without rehearsal. So, take something like a phone number. It used to be they were all 7-digit numbers, but now we have to tend to remember the area code as well. So that's kind of pushing your short-term memory. If somebody were to say to you, hey, what's your phone number? My office phone number used to be 512 would you be able to remember that long enough if I told you that to call me the next time you needed to? So short-term memory is rather limited. And, for example, Social Security numbers are 9 digits long. If they were longer than that, people would have more difficulty remembering them. Most of you know your Social Security number or your phone number, but how many of you know your City of Austin utility customer number, which tends to be about, you know, a mile long. It might be 15 or so digits. We don't tend to remember things like that. It's too long. It can't even make it uh, into our short-term memories so that we can shift it into our long-term memory. And short-term memory is typically less than 30 seconds. So if I talk too fast during a lecture, people are going to be raising their hand. That's one advantage to doing it online is you can pause it. But if it's in the classroom, people are got their hands up and they're like, "Hey, hold on, wait, what? Can you repeat what you just said, please?" You're several minutes down the road with your lecture, and I'm still writing what you said a couple of minutes ago. Slow down, please. Repeat what you just said, please. You've exceeded my short-term memory. And so, to remember something, you got to encode it, you got to store it, you got to retrieve it. In order to do all of that, you've got to get it from your sensory memory into your short-term memory, and then you've got to shift it into your long-term memory. Theoretically, once something's in your long-term memory, it's in there permanently, theoretically, anyway. Let's talk about long-term memories. There are two types. There are implicit and explicit. Implicit long-term memories are long-term memories without conscious recall. They tend to be automatic, whereas explicit or declarative long-term memories happen with conscious recall. Now, implicit, non-declarative memories that happen without conscious recall are things like motor skills. This is known as procedural memory. For example, how many of you know how to ride a bike? When was the last time you rode a bike? Well, for some of you, maybe it was today. But for some of you, maybe you haven't ridden one for 6 months or a year. But if there were a bike available and I gave it to you, would you be able to get on it and ride it? Of course. You don't forget things like that. It's an implicit, without conscious recall kind of thing. Same with something like bowling. How many of you have ever gone bowling? When was the last time you went bowling? Maybe it was a couple of years ago. But if the class went bowling, I bet you could pick out a ball and you would remember the steps you had to take and how to roll it. Okay, maybe you'd roll a gutter ball or two, but in no time at all, you'd be rolling strikes right down the middle, wouldn't you? Why? Because you don't forget something like that. It's motor memory. You don't forget how to do those things. Don't you wish that academics were that easy to recall? That they were just automatic. Classical and operant conditioning effects also happen this way. And, consequently, back when we were studying learning, and, I told you about the uh, patient who developed anxiety disorder when he was driving his car over the bridge on Lady Bird Lake, and it started to shimmer uncontrollably. Uh, and suddenly he felt like he was going to crash. And then after that, even though he was in a car that was safe, excuse me, when he approached the same bridge, his body automatically reacted a certain way. Why? Because of classical conditioning effects, which happen without conscious recall. Explicit, on the other hand, declarative types of memories that happen with conscious recall are much harder to pull out of your long-term memory. And this includes facts, general knowledge. This is known as semantic memory. It's information that you're learning in your various courses. And then when you have to take a test over the information, how readily can you pull that information back into memory on the test? Don't we all wish it was without conscious recall? But it's not. It's with conscious recall. And then also personally experienced events. This is known as episodic memory. And so, when things happen to us personally, we can recall those things more easily. like, what was the last concert you may have gone to? You might remember all the details, where it was, what kinds of music was played, who you were with, all those kinds of things. You can remember those things because it's episodic memory. It was personally experienced events, and those are done with conscious recall. Um, but facts and general knowledge, these are the hardest things to recall. Something I want you to do, I tried doing this as a part of my lecture when I made this the first time uh, and experienced technical difficulties. But in this section, uh, there are some links that I want you to go to and listen to and watch about a lady named Jill Price who remembers every day of her life in detail. How much of your life do you remember in detail, and how far back? I think you'll find this audio and this video clip absolutely fascinating. And I'm not going to try and show it to you right now because of technical problems, but the links are in this section. Let's talk about a couple of unusual memory phenomenon, and these include flashbulb memories and eidetic imagery. Flashbulb memory is formed when you learn of an event that is surprising and highly emotional. Um, Maybe one you might have uh, is, do you remember where you were when you first heard some of the feedback we were getting about how dangerous COVID was? This takes us back to 2020. I remember being in class and hearing that after spring break, maybe spring break was going to get extended. And I remember the classroom I was in when I heard about this. I remember talking to various students about it. And I'll probably remember this to my dying day because it's a flashbulb memory. Um, some of you are probably too young to know about some of the big phenomena that have happened in recent years, like where you were when 9/11 happened, for example. I'll never forget. I was uh, teaching some classes at the Pinnacle campus of ACC, and I remember it was a Tuesday, Thursday morning class I had, and I was in the kitchen cleaning up the dishes, and I had the radio on to catch the weather and all of that when there was an announcement that a plane had hit one of the twin towers in New York City. And it was like, oh my gosh. And I went and turned on our television set in the living room only to see the second plane hit the second twin tower. And so, it's just etched in my mind what it looked like, where I was when it happened, the day of the week, and everything else about it. It's a flashbulb memory. It was formed when I learned of an event that is surprising and very emotional. And then there's eidetic imagery, which some people call a photographic memory. The ability to retain an image of a visual stimulus several minutes after it has been removed from view. Um, any of you have a photographic memory? If you do, all the rest of us are jealous. that you can just read something and you automatically know it, or see something and you automatically know it. You don't forget it. Um, you probably make hundreds on all your tests. I had a professor when I was a freshman in college who had a photographic memory. I've got to tell you this story about this guy. I was taking fifth year Latin when I was in my first year of college. I had had 4 years of Latin in high school. And so all I needed was one semester of Latin in order to complete my foreign language requirements for my degree. And so, I was going to Baylor University. It's a sizable college, and I thought, in my fourth year Latin class, there were only 4 or 5 of us students, and they had us in with a third year class. I thought, well, this is a pretty good size university. It might be a regular size class. I went to class, and there were 150 people in my fifth year Latin class. Just turned out it was one of the most popular professors on the campus. And our first day of class, well, the there were too many students for the room. It was in a room that held maybe 40 students, and there were 150 people showed up. And I remember that day I didn't even get a seat. I was leaning up against the wall, and the professor went around the room the first day and he said, "Tell me your name. Tell me your name. Tell me your name," to each 150 students. Next day we had class. There was a notice outside the classroom that said class had been moved to a lecture hall in the biology building, a room that could hold that many people. And what I would tell you is every time I went to that class, I never sat in the same seat twice. I sat wherever there was an empty seat in this big lecture hall. And the professor never took roll. So he didn't have a seating chart or anything like that. Anyway, halfway through the semester, he finally gave us a test where we had to translate Latin into English. And then, it took him a while to grade all those tests. Eventually, he walks into the room with all the graded papers to hand them back. And he walked up to each student and looked at them and flipped through this huge pack of papers and handed him their paper. I just couldn't believe it. And I thought, no, there's no way he's going to remember me. This guy has no clue what my idea is. I'm sorry, what my name is. He can't possibly get this right. He walked up to me, looked at me, flipped through the stack, handed me my paper. I just blew my mind. How could he know it? Now, granted, he probably had some of these other students other semesters for, beginning Latin or intermediate Latin or whatever. Um, but so he probably already knew a bunch of the names. But the fact that all I did was tell him my name and he remembered it a couple of months later, amazing. He had a photographic memory. I might add that I would run into that guy on campus, uh, you know, years later when I was in graduate school, and he'd say, "Hi, Dan." It's like he still remembers my name. This is amazing. Absolutely amazing. He had a photographic memory. Well, let's talk about factors that influence retrieval of memories. And one is the serial position effect. We tend to remember things that we first heard or last heard, like with a series of numbers and so on. We tend to forget the stuff in the middle. I always say if you're going in for an interview for a job, be the first person interviewed or the last person interviewed. Because if you're the first person interviewed, they're going to compare everybody else to you. If you're the last person interviewed, you're going to be the freshest in their mind. But bless your heart, if you're one of the ones in the middle, you don't have a chance. They're going to forget all about you. Serial possession effect. Environmental context plays a role in memory. We tend to remember things associated with certain environments. How many of you are from out of town? When you go back to your hometown, you suddenly start thinking about things you hadn't thought of in a long time just because now you're back in that environment. You know, when I go back to Waco, uh, to the Baylor campus. Everywhere I go on the campus, memories come back to me of things that happened in that part of the campus or people I was with, things I may have been doing, and so on. That, typically when I'm in Austin, I don't think about anything that went on at Baylor. But when I'm back at Waco, I think about those things. So environmental context plays a big factor. And then the state of your mind plays a big factor um, in memory. So, when you're happy, you think about all kinds of happy things. And when you're angry, you think about all kinds of things that tick you off. And when you're sad, you think about all kinds of things that have made you sad. And then stress and anxiety can affect your memory. Yeah, have you ever gone to take a test and right before the test, something upsetting happened and then you got in the room and you couldn't remember anything? It's because of that stressful situation. Uh, or maybe you were going to be in some kind of production. Maybe you had a part in a play or something, and you were very stressed out about it. And you walked out on the stage, and suddenly the stress just erased your mind of your lines. So, stress can play a real important factor in whether or not you can remember something. Well, let's talk about causes of forgetting. Why do we forget things anyway? Well, number one, I think, is an encoding failure. And this goes back to my own personal definition of learning. And that is you've learned something when you can demonstrate that something when it needs to be demonstrated. And remember, another uh, definition of learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior based on experience. And I would suggest that one of the main reasons you forget things is you never learned it to begin with. It never made it into your long-term memory. It never made it from sensory memory into short-term memory into long-term memory. You didn't forget, you never learned it. Encoding failure. Another thing is consolidation failure. And of course, this is what happens when someone's knocked unconscious in an accident or something like that. I think about a story about Troy Aikman back when he was the quarterback of the Dallas Cowboys. He was playing in a game, and it was late in the game, and the Cowboys were driving for a touchdown, and Troy completed a pass for a touchdown, and as soon as he let go of the ball, he got tackled and knocked unconscious. In fact, during his career, he had a number of head injuries. When Troy woke up, he was in the hospital. And who was with him? His agent, of course. And Troy said to his agent, "Where am I?" "Well, you're in the hospital, you know." Well, how did I get here? Well, you were playing in a football game and you threw a pass, and right after you let go of the ball, you got tackled and you hit your head on the ground and you got knocked unconscious. Did I complete the pass? Yes. Yes. You completed it for a touchdown. We won the game. Oh, wow. That's great. Where am I? You're in the hospital. How did I get here? Well, you were in a football game. I mean, in that short length of time, he had already forgotten what he had been told. So he had no recollection of completing the pass for a touchdown and winning the game because before that memory had time to consolidate, he was knocked unconscious. It's a consolidation failure. This resulted in a brain injury or dementia, uh, which might be defined as pathological loss of memory. That's why some people can't remember things. They've sustained a brain injury of some kind. And then there's decay. And this brings up research by a guy by the name of Herman Ebbinghaus, uh, who wanted to study memory, but one problem that comes in studying memory is uh, there are lots of environmental factors that can interfere with memory. For example, the lighting in the room, the temperature in the room, how you feel on a certain day. You know, do you not feel well? Did you not get enough sleep the night before? Things like that. And so he decided to study memory using himself as his only subject. And what Ebbinghaus did was he dreamed up what he called nonsense syllables. And a nonsense syllable is a word that's not really a word. It's has a consonant vowel consonant pattern to it, but it's not a real word. For example, ledge, L-E-J, L consonant, E vowel, J consonant, ledge. So, you know, something like dog or cat or something like that, that's not a nonsense word uh, because it's a real word. But anything that's a consonant, vowel, consonant that's not a real word, Ebbinghaus called a nonsense syllable. Believe it or not, he dreamed up 2,200 of these things, and he would memorize them in lists of, 20 or 30. And he would go over the list over and over and over again until he could repeat it without error 2 times in a row. Then he considered himself to have learned the list. And then he would, wait uh, a number of minutes and test himself again. And then he would wait an even longer period of time and test himself again. And, he would test himself again the next day and see how many of the words in the list from the previous day he could remember. And he came up with his famous learning curve or forgetting curve, I guess I should say. What Ebbinghaus discovered was that Forgetting initially is rapid and then it kind of levels off. Forgetting is initially rapid and then it levels off. When I was in graduate school, I decided to do a little study of my own. Uh, I was teaching undergraduate courses like this one, and I was wondering just how well students' memories would last from one semester to the next. And so what I did was I contacted students who had had me in the fall for a particular course, and I sent them a note asking them if they wouldn't mind going into the university library in the reserve room and retaking a test that they had taken in the fall. It would just so happen it was test one that they had taken in the fall. So this was a test they had taken in September. And now it was the spring semester, and they were taking it in February. And I said, don't restudy for it or anything. I'm just curious as to how much you remembered from the fall to the spring semester. And just go in and retake the test. And here's what I found. And the first thing you'll discover is not very many students um, took me up on my request. Uh, I got out of a class with like 30 students. This is all that did it. But the person who made a 96 in September made a 68 in late February. The person who made a 94 in September made a 70 in February. 92 made a 66. 90 made a 64. 88 made a 70. 88 made a 72, and so on, all the way down to the person who made a 78 made a 56. So what can we conclude here? Well, one thing is that whether the student made an A, a B, or a C in September, they all made the same mediocre score in late February, somewhere around a D. That's about it. A D or a D plus, maybe. That's it. Um, I concluded that, and on the other hand, I did an item analysis, and I did this based on what we call Bloom's taxonomy. I mentioned this earlier in the semester uh, during my orientation video, but test items based on Bloom's taxonomy, we concern ourselves with three different levels. Knowledge level questions are things like a definition of something or a fact of some kind. A comprehension level question would be, can you pick out an example of something? Uh, a application level question would be, can you take what you've learned and make a prediction? Well, guess what? All the students, the items that they tended to get correct in late February tended to be application level questions and comprehension level questions. In other words, they could pick out an example of something. They could take the concepts that were taught and apply them to other situations. What they tended to forget was all those fact items. Uh, Uh, and so that's not surprising. And there was kind of a regression toward the mean, if you will. Um, so it goes back to this decay. I'm sorry, this isn't the one I want. I gotta wait for the, there we go. Let's go back to Ebbinghaus here. So, just like Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve, my students, they initially forgot all that nitty gritty definitions and facts, but then their learning leveled off and they all remembered basically the same things, which made me feel good. What they remembered was what really mattered, and what they had forgotten kind of didn't matter. Another cause of forgetting is interference, and interference can be proactive or retroactive. A proactive interference would be where you learn one thing and then you learn something else, and what you had learned initially interferes with you learning the second thing. I like to say you learn A and then you study B, but A interferes with your learning B. Uh, One example that's often given is where you learn one foreign language and then you study another foreign language, and what you learn the first time interferes with learning that second language. Like maybe in high school, you took Spanish, and then in college, you took French. And the deeper you got into French, the more the Spanish interfered with learning the French. You kept mixing the two up. One example I like to give is I never had a course in keyboarding or typing. And so, I've always been a hunt and peck typist. And I'm one of the fastest hunt and peck typists I know, but nevertheless, I can't sit in a classroom with my computer in front of me and look at the person who's talking and type away. I have to be looking at my keyboard at the same time. And so I decided I was going to teach myself the right way to type. And so I bought this computer program called Mario Teaches Typing. Most of you are probably familiar with Mario, the cute little Nintendo guy who's in all kinds of video games. Well, guess what? Mario could not succeed in teaching me the correct way to type. You know why? Because I had taught myself the wrong way and had done it for so long that it interfered with me learning the right way to type. That was proactive interference. Retroactive interference is where you learn one thing and then you learn something else, and then what you more recently learned interferes with your recall of what you learned the first time. Uh, give me an example of um, this in action. Um, One semester, it was early in the spring semester, and um, I had gone out to eat with my family at a restaurant. And when I walked in the door, I saw one of my students from the fall semester. This was early in the spring semester. And he was eating in the restaurant with his dad, and he started waving at me, hey, come on over here. I want to introduce you to my dad. And he said, I was in your intro. to psych class last fall and I made an A. And I said, yes, I know. You did a really good job. And I said, but I'll be honest with you right now, I can't recall your name. I can't think of your name. And he said, oh, that's okay. I can't remember yours either. I said, hey, wait a minute. I had 150 students last semester. You only had a handful of professors. But since you made an A in my class, you tell me why I can't think of your name right now. And the reason I couldn't think of his name is because of retroactive interference. You know, in the fall semester, I had 150 students, and by the end of the semester, I had learned all of their names. But now it was the spring semester, and I had 150 new students to remember their names. And those are the names that were freshest in my mind. But now I saw a student from the fall semester. And so what was fresh in my mind were current students' names, and I couldn't retrieve his name. Had you showed me a list of a roster of everybody in the class, I would have been able to pick out this guy's name, but I at that moment I couldn't. Why? Because of retroactive interference. Consequently, when you're studying for a test, remember this: whatever test you have first, study that material last. Because let's say you've got a history class and a psychology class, and on the same day you have a test in both classes. And let's say your psychology class is in the morning. Well, here's how you should study. The night before, study history, then study psychology, then take the psychology test, then take the history test. You don't want to study it the other way around. If you studied psychology, then studied history, and then took the psychology test, what would be freshest in your mind would be history information. And so that would interfere with you retrieving the psychology information. So, whatever test you might have first, study that material last, and it will be the freshest in your mind, and you can avoid retroactive interference. Excuse me, by the same token, I think it's important to take tests in this online class as soon as it becomes available. Because if you don't, then more and more material will be getting introduced, and then the newer material will be fresh in your mind and not the older material that you're taking a test on. And so the newer material will interfere with your recall of the older material, and you'll become victim of retroactive interference. Another cause of forgetting is motivated forgetting. Oh, I forgot. No, you didn't forget. You know, that's just an excuse. Uh, somebody, you got a friend that wants to have lunch with you, and you don't really want to have lunch with them, but they keep bugging you about it, and you finally say, okay, fine, I'll meet you at Rudy's. I'll meet you at Rudy's on North Lamar Thursday at noon. And Thursday at noon comes, and you're not there. And your friend calls you on your cell phone and says, where are you? I'm here at Rudy's and you're not here. Where are you? And you go, oh, I forgot. Well, you didn't forget. You didn't want to have lunch with him, but how can he get mad at you for saying you forgot? Or let's face it, if there's an important event and we don't want to forget it, we're going to put it on our calendar. We're going to put it on our phone or something like that. But if you kind of don't want to do whatever the thing is, You just never get around to putting it onto your calendar. It's motivated forgetting at that point. And then there's a retrieval failure. How many of you have a junk drawer at home? What do you keep in your junk drawer? A little bit of everything. Is it nicely organized in there in different compartments? Say, no, it's a junk drawer. I just throw everything in there and push it down and shove the drawer in. Well, I think a lot of us have um, a cognitive junk drawer, if you will, that we don't neatly store things in our brains. And then when it's time to retrieve it, we can't find it. It's just kind of a jumbled mess in there. You experience a retrieval failure. Sometimes this happens. Oh, like, have you ever been trying to remember the name of a movie that you saw years ago and you cannot think of it at that moment? You just kind of have a mental block, and then you're trying to tell somebody about it and you can't think of the name of the movie because you're going to recommend it to the person. And then 10 minutes after you've left the person, you remember it. Well, you found it in your mental junk drawer. You had a retrieval failure. So, what can you do to improve your memory? One, you can get organized. I became a much better student after I took uh, a couple of courses in speech. And how that helped me was it forced me to organize what I wanted to say. I had to learn to speak from an outline. And so I organized my thoughts. And by doing that, I learned to organize my study habits, organize the material that I was studying. So getting organized is one of the absolutely best things that you can do to improve your memory. In speech, I learned to speak from an outline. I learned to analyze the audience and what they might want to hear. I learned to organize the material that I was going to be presenting. And that helped my memory of what I wanted to talk about. Overlearning is another way to improve your memory. You just keep going over it and over it and over it and over it till you know it. How many of you have ever been in a play or something like that, where you had lines that you had to recite? And chances are you went over and over and over and over those lines until they became automatic. And even uh, on the way to the theater, you were going over your lines in the car. And maybe when you got to the theater and you were backstage before you went on stage for your scene, a stagehand had the script and you were reciting your lines to the person. And then, maybe you got on stage and you still forgot some of your lines, but you knew enough of what they were about that you could successfully ad lib, and the audience never knew. Overlearning. Make the material personally meaningful. Again, episodic memory. Things that pertain to ourselves, we can remember better than things that we can't relate to at all. So if you can find a way to make the material personally meaningful, it will improve your memory. Activate retrieval cues. One thing they say is to do better on tests, you might actually study the material in the room where it was presented. Uh, And that way, just being in the room will bring back the memories of the material. I know I did this. I spent many months studying for the psychology board exam to get licensed as a psychologist, and then I found out what room uh, in one of the state office buildings they were going to be giving the test in, and I took myself uh, into that room with a practice test, and I took the test in that room because I thought when I actually take the test, having studied for it in this room, just being in the room should help activate retrieval cues. Guess what happened? The day of the test, they moved us to a different room. So I managed to pass anyway. Minimize interference. Uh, Again, whatever test you have first, study for that test last so as to minimize the chances of retroactive interference. Spaced versus mass practice. It's much better to space out practice than cramming at the last minute. You know, after every time you attend a class and you take notes, go back over your notes after class. And before class begins the next time you're in the room, go back over those notes again. Uh, Study them week long. Don't try and cram all at the end. I don't know about you, but when I read books, I would much rather read a book with 10-page chapters than a book with 30-page chapters. If you're anything like me, you know, you're looking ahead, how many more pages is this going to be? So you're spacing out your learning. And I find that if I'm studying things in smaller bits over a long period of time, I will do better than if I try to do it all at once. We used to have Monday, Wednesday, Friday classes at ACC, and students generally did better in those than they did in classes that only met one day a week. Um, or classes that met 2 days a week. It's especially good to space out your learning in courses like math, statistics, and things like that. Recitation versus rereading. One of the best things you can do is have a study partner and have the study partner ask you review questions. Like I provide review questions before each test. Get a study partner to ask you those questions. It doesn't even have to be somebody who's taking psychology. It just if it's somebody who can ask the questions, and then if you can explain your answer to them in a way that they understand what you're talking about, then you probably know what you're talking about. The trouble with rereading is you reread right over what you already know and you kind of skip over what you don't know, kidding yourself that there won't be any questions about it on the test. So recitation is much better. I think having a study partner is one of the best things that you can ever do when learning material. And then there are mnemonic devices. You know, these are little sayings and things like that. Like if you ever took music lessons, you might have learned the names of the scales. You know, every good boy does fine, or all cows eat grass and things like that or, you know, to remember how many days in various months, you know, 30 days have September, April, June, and November. All the rest have 31, but February has 28. Doesn't even rhyme, but it's a mnemonic device that some people have acquired and employed in order to help remember how many days are in a month. You know, one problem one problem that exists for all of us today is that we don't exercise our minds like we need to. You know, we all got these crazy contraptions called smartphones. And, you know, instead of remembering information, we look it up on our smartphones. This isn't really good. It isn't good for your mind. And there's a lot of inaccurate stuff out there in cyberspace for that matter. Memory is an important thing. And, you know, how are we going to assess dementia in the future if they don't know how to input stuff in their smartphones? Or if they're unable to know that the information they get back from the questions they input in their smartphones is incorrect. Um, this is becoming a significant issue, the whole topic of memory. There are several short videos I want you to watch now that you've seen this. And one is about a guy who sustained a head injury. It affected his hippocampus, which interferes with his memory of key things. I want you to watch that. I want you to watch the Jill Price video clip where she remembers every day of her life. There's also a video clip of the guy named Rahajan Madhavan who has, get this, memorized, oh gosh, I want to say it was the first 30,000 digits of pi or something like that. Might have been more than that. I'm having a memory problem right now. Why would anybody memorize the first 30,000 digits of pi? I might not even have that right. It might be more than that. Um, I always say so. If you run out of stuff to talk about on a date, you can just start rattling off digits of pi. Anyway, this guy has, and he's a super memorist, and he is going to give you some additional suggestions on how to improve your memory. So be sure and watch that too. Wait till you see the matrix that he's able to memorize and then do it in reverse. He would do quite well on the Wechsler memory scales for sure. So watch that. And then you'll be able to move on to the next topic. That's it.